I spent my life doubting UFO tales, until one night in a house nobody else seemed to believe us about changed everything. I still call them UFO encounters because that's the only label that fits. Unexplained, unsettling, impossible to pin down. I was a skeptic up until the sound that felt like the world breaking right outside my bedroom window. We were staying at my boyfriend's parents' secluded place. It sits on a lot of acreage, wooded, quiet, the kind of property where your closest neighbor is the wind. His parents were away that week, so it was just the two of us. It was supposed to be a simple weekend, dinner, a movie, falling asleep to the familiar creaks of an old house. Ordinary, safe. Then just after 1 a.m, something hit the night like a hand on the throat of the world. It started with a noise, no, not a noise, a blast. A horn-like blast that didn't sound like any horn I'd ever heard. It was deeper than a car horn, wrapped in a vibration that went through the china in the cabinets and through the bones behind my eyes. The windows rattled. The whole house trembled in a way I could feel under my feet, like someone had hammered the earth itself. I bolted upright. He bolted up next to me. We both listened, breath shallow, waiting for whatever would come next. There was a second, a thin, unreal pause, and then a bright flash lit the room like a camera's bulb. For one heartbeat, everything was white. The floodlight over the driveway kicked on at the same instant, bathing the side of the house in cruel, clinical light. It was wrong for that hour, too deliberate, too targeted. We moved toward the window because you move toward windows when your house announces it's no longer only yours. My boyfriend nudged the blind up. At the edge of the yard, just beyond where the light reached, 2 dark shapes swayed in a slow, almost mechanical rhythm. They were not people we knew. They weren't standing the way people stand. From where we were, they were silhouettes, tallish, featureless against the light. They didn't come toward the window. They hung there, as if watching the house. And then I heard it, a whispering sound. It wasn't words. It was a soft mumble, like someone with their mouth full, like a radio knocked loose between stations. It carried in the night and hugged the walls of the house. The hair on my arms went stiff. My phone vibrated in my pocket against my thigh, a small human echo of the huge, unnatural noise outside. I checked it without thinking. No signal, no bars, nothing. I tapped the screen until my thumb hurt. Nothing. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He nodded. His face went hard and pale in the floodlight, and I realized I was clinging to the edge of the sill because my hands had started to shake. He reached for the doorknob on the side door, on instinct, just to make sure it was locked, and it was. We locked that door and the front door after that, because that's what you do when something strange is outside. We were kids again, convincing ourselves the lock would do anything against whatever that was. Then, as if someone were testing the house like a curious animal, both doors blew open. The sound wasn't a creak. It wasn't the slow giving way of old hinges. It was like someone had grabbed the house by the throat and yanked both doors out of their frames for a single violent second. The doors flew inward, slamming against the kitchen counters. Papers fluttered. The house sucked in night air, and the whispering grew louder, as if it had been waiting for that moment to press itself into our ears. I remember trying to call my boyfriend's parents. I remember the phone displaying 3 bars. 1, 2, then nothing. The line dropped out as if the world had unplugged us. It came back for just a moment, long enough for us to hear a ring that went nowhere, and then died again. The timing felt deliberate, as if the static and deadness were part of the event, not a coincidence. I did the only adult thing I could think to do. I called the police. My voice felt small over the line. The operator asked obvious questions. "Are you safe? Are there weapons? Has anyone broken in?" I said no one had broken in because no one had come through the door, yet the doors had been forced inward. I said the voices were outside, that something had hit the house, that our phones had died. I asked for someone to come. It took a while. We stayed up all night with the lights on, the television murmuring like a companion but not looking at us. We didn't sleep. We didn't leave the house. We moved from room to room in the flat, jittery litany of people waiting out a storm. The floodlight stayed on, casting a pool of unforgiving amber over the yard until dawn. The shapes at the edge of our property never approached the porch again. They didn't need to. The house had been violated in the simplest way. A sound, a light, a shove, and that was enough. The cop who showed up was polite and practical. He walked the perimeter like they teach you in basic procedural checks. Look for footprints. Check the mud where someone might have come up from the back. He had a flashlight and a skeptical set to his jaw. His words were the kind of words that seek to flatten oddness. "Probably kids messing around," he said. "Weather, sirens, someone with a loud muffler." He peered under the eaves and at the wheel tracks in the long grass. He asked how many people had been inside and whether anyone owned firearms. Men who get paid to believe in neat explanations will give you neat answers. He came back inside and sat at the kitchen table. He tried to make small talk, the way people do when they're trying to keep themselves from smelling fear. We told him about the horn-like sound, the ground shaking, the flash. He wrote something in a notepad. He asked me very plainly whether either of us had been drinking. He asked if we'd been on any medications that might make us hear things. He checked my eyes for the dilated pupils of someone who's not telling the truth or someone who's hallucinating. I met his gaze and said the truth. We were sober. We were not on medication. We were terrified, and we did not understand what had happened. Then we walked him to the backyard. It was a weird, silent walk. The air felt heavy and oily. The mud at the back door was churned, but not in a way that made sense. There were no footprints. Not a single clear print like a ghost had walked through the yard. The ground was damp, and the grass was flattened in patches, but nothing definitive. He crouched down and ran gloved fingers through the dirt. "Could be animals," he said. "Could be rutting deer, coyotes, could be the wind." He meant it. He needed one of those options to be true. He stood up and adjusted his jacket, and his breath clouded in the pre-dawn air like nothing else existed there. He didn't know what the whispering had sounded like. He hadn't felt his teeth rattle from the blast. He hadn't watched the doors fly open when he wasn't even inside. He could not feel the not knowing we were carrying. After he left, after he promised he'd file a report and that they'd check the patrol logs for anything similar, we sat in the living room until the sun put a thin orange line across the driveway. We drank coffee we didn't taste. We watched the floodlight's edge retreat as daylight took over. The town cop's skepticism settled around us like a second skin. He believed the physical evidence and the lack of footprint, and that made it worse in some ways. If there was no one on the ground, then what had done it? We tried to tell people. We told friends. We told his parents, haltingly, like you're supposed to tuck the upsetting things into sentences so they fit on a page. Some were sympathetic. Most assumed we were exaggerating, or that stress and weird sleep had puppeted our imaginations. A few laughed. The laughter hurt more than any speculation. Nobody asked how the china had shivered in the cabinet, or how the floodlight had come on when the rest of the neighborhood was dark. Nobody asked about the phones going in and out on the same breath. Most people wanted a neat ending, and there wasn't one. We slept in shifts for a week. Any little sound made us both jolt. We imagined silhouettes in windows where there were none. The house, which had always been a welcoming chaos of familiar things, felt foreign, as if someone had rearranged the corners while we weren't looking. I stopped leaving my phone on the nightstand. I kept it in my pocket and watched the bars like a patient waits for a diagnosis. After that night, we could have written the whole thing off as an isolated prank, a strange anomaly. The neighbor kids could have been testing Bluetooth speakers or playing some prank with explosives. We wanted to believe something like that, but the evidence refused to cooperate. The mud had no footprints. The officer's gloves picked up nothing. The floodlight circuit board, when my boyfriend's dad finally checked, did not show signs of tampering. The whole event smelled like something that had been there and left no trace. And here's the thing about people who have spent their lives as skeptics. You build a scaffold of explanations around yourself. You take comfort in probability. You roll the dice 1,000 times and the pattern looks sensible. Then once, just once, something happens that sits outside those probabilities and the scaffold gives. Not catastrophically. Not always immediately. It just loosens. You notice the seams. You stop assuming that the only answers are the ones you've been taught to expect. We learn to be quiet about it, not because we wanted to hide, but because talking about it became something heavier than the words themselves. People who have never stood in a kitchen while the doors are yanked open by no visible hand don't understand the way silence thickens after an event like that. It's as if silence becomes a place where you store the unanswered bits, and you carry that place around with you like a secret. It would have been easier if that had been the end. If it was a one-night fluke, a story to tell at parties and then set aside, but it wasn't. That was just the beginning. If you want more first-hand UFO accounts, like and subscribe. There are more stories coming. I promise the rest are no less strange. A few weeks after the house, I found myself staying at a lakeside camp that belonged to my parents. I had moved there temporarily after a breakup, seeking the company of water and the easy rhythm of a place where the distance between me and anyone I knew could be measured in the curve of a shoreline. The lake is huge. From the cabin you can stare out over an almost infinite black, and nights there feel like the earth holds its breath. I had a dog with me. A black lab named Zemo, who could track a scent through a storm. Zemo didn't startle easily. The first night, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The kind of quiet that settles over water at night. The light slap of waves against logs, the chirr of crickets, was a balm. I left the porch light off and watched the stars. The breakup still throbbed in me like an open tooth, and the small, steady companionship of Zemo was a tether. The moon slid its silver across the lake, and I slept. On the second night I noticed lights on the horizon. Little at first. 2, 3 bright pinpricks that shouldn't have been there. Boats do have lights, but these didn't move like boats. They danced. They darted sideways. They shot up into the sky and vanished. When they reappeared, they seemed closer, as if the lake itself had decided to rearrange its stars. Zemo rose from his place on the rug and lowered his head to the floorboards, his ears tipping like compass needles. He refused to go outside when I called him. He sat at the threshold and gave me a look I had never seen before, equivalent to a human's shiver. I told myself I would take a video. I reached for my phone. It blinked 4G for a second, but the signal flickered and then went dead. The same deadness from the house, no bars, spinning wheel of frustration, denial. I held the phone in both hands, as if the gravity of it would convince the network to be kind. Nothing. Then, without warning, the lights on the horizon shot straight up and disappeared. The sky reopened like a curtain. I tried to explain it away. Satellite flares, a prank with drones, flares from a far-off boat, but none of those fit both the motion and the sound or lack of sound. There was no engine noise, no wakes on the water, no fishermen swearing they'd been in the bay. Each evening, the lights returned. They never came close enough to touch the shore, but they moved with an intelligence I couldn't give them as a gift. They merged into larger points and then separated again like atoms rearranging. On the third night the show changed. The lights appeared earlier and closer. One evening I watched 2 small orbs meet in the sky and, with a motion so smooth it made me dizzy, they joined into one larger globe of light. It hovered there, perfectly still for a long stretch of minutes, and then it dipped. I thought it would descend into the black water, but instead it moved toward the shore in a slow, buoyant glide. A faint humming sound accompanied it, so low it felt like a memory of sound rather than a sound itself. Zemo's hackles raised, his pupils were huge and black. The orb began to bounce, darting at the waterline and then into the trees, like a mischievous animal playing on the boundary of two worlds. It never made contact with anything. It seemed to consider the dock as if weighing the possibility of touching it, and then decided not to. When it was close enough that I could see its edges more clearly, it wasn't a smooth metal sphere or a crafted object like you'd see in a movie. It was an almost impossible luminous shape. Its surface pulsated like a living thing, then dimmed, then brightened. I called a friend, an old roommate who owed me his life with his circle of reliable skepticism. I told him to come see, to just drive out and tell me whether he'd seen anything like it. My phone blinked with a bar of service and died again while I was still on the line. When my friend finally drove out, he came the next evening. He squinted up at the sky and offered, in that tone friends use when they think you need grounding, probably drones or a light show. He took some video, laughed nervously, and told me he had to get back. The footage he took was shaky and lovely, and somehow both proved and disproved everything. The light in his video is there, a thing moving in ways that make your neck ache to follow. But like so many videos of strange things, it didn't make the impossible reasonable. I spent nights walking the dock, Zemo at my heels, the lamps along the shoreline blinking themselves awake. The dog refused to enter the water after one particular pass the lights made. He stayed by me, body rigid, for hours. When the lights finally disappeared, Zemo would shake himself and act like nothing had happened, as if the experience didn't belong to him. That behavioral flip only made me more unsettled. I searched for answers online. I read local forums and municipal reports. People posted blurry photos. Someone suggested atmospheric reflections. Someone else suspected a secretive military exercise, a word that comforts because it gives a designated cause. The town didn't have records indicating scheduled flights or exercises during those nights. My posts on the local group drew half-sympathetic replies and a few jokes. Skepticism again wrapped itself around my experience. Not as a shield, but as a challenge. Make it make sense. I filed an anonymous account with an online UFO database, my own small act of confession. I wanted the experience recorded somewhere that didn't ask me to be rational in the moment. Recording it felt like towing a small white flag. The database accepted the entry and gave me a cold, automated confirmation code. No one called. No one came. No one knocked on the cabin door. The lights kept coming and going, and I kept getting up to look. That second story was just warming up when life forced a shift in me. Work, obligations, the absurd rhythm of days that insist on proceeding pulled me away. I left the cabin but kept thinking about the way the orb had hovered over the water, as if deciding whether to step from one element into another. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was carrying not just one image, but a pattern. Isolation, uncanny sensory cues, and the loss of ordinary signals, phones, footprints, patrols that can only offer probably as an answer. Three things knitting themselves into a design that no explanation so far accommodated. Skeptical people tell themselves that patterns are our brain's way of finding meaning where there is none. I used to be one of those people. Now I notice patterns and hold them like a piece of warm metal, too hot to touch for long, but impossible to ignore. A couple of months later, I would have another experience, one that was quieter but more intimate, and perhaps the most disorienting of all. But that comes later. For now, the lights over the lake kept returning in my head. Sometimes in the corners of dreams. I didn't know if they would stay in the story as proof of anything. I only knew they had registered something in me that didn't want to be explained away. These first two things, one in a house with doors yanked open, one over a lake with orbs that moved like thinking creatures, took pieces of my certainty. They unset the logic I'd built up over years. the steady belief that most things could be reduced to cause and effect. I still reached for explanations, of course. We all do. It's our defense. But the explanations slid off like rain on oil. I kept thinking of the officer's gloves in that muddy backyard, of Zemo refusing to step into the night. I kept thinking about how the brightness of a floodlight can make shadows look guilty, and how a bright flash makes you imagine things into being. I kept thinking about how easy it is for people to say probably or maybe, as if one of those words could smooth the unease a strange night leaves in your gut. If you think the first two were strange, wait until you hear the next. This third one was quieter at first, but it unspooled into something worse, less spectacle, more the kind of close, intimate wrongness that rewires how you stand in the dark. By then, my life had weirdly rearranged itself. I was traveling with Rachel and our 2 kids in an RV. We were on a low-key weekend trip, campground tucked against a ridge of pines, the way every small town seems to have one stretch of trees that collects trailers and tents. The kids fell asleep early in the back bunk. Rachel was next to them, breathing even in the small white light of the camper. I went outside because I needed a cigarette and a minute of air. There's a place at the edge of the campsite with a narrow, rocky ledge that looks over a slope of scrub and then a thicker stand of woods. It's one of those spots where, at night, the world narrows to the scrape of wind and your own small hands. I had my lighter out, leaning on the rail, when I heard it, first like a distant synth note, then like an organ held underwater. A pulsing hum. It wasn't a hum that vibrated in the teeth the way thunder sometimes does. It was more of a pressure against the inside of my skull. It rose and fell in a rhythm that made the boards under my boots feel less solid. I put a hand to the railing and realized my fingers were tingling in time with the pulse. The cigarette went unlit in my other hand. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 10 feet beyond where I stood, something moved. Not a branch, not an animal, a shape, tall, thin, wrong in proportion, like a person someone stretched on a photocopier. I say person because it had the suggestion of a neck and shoulders, but it didn't occupy the human outline I know. It stood with a kind of loping stillness, a silhouette against a smear of deeper darkness. I blinked because my brain wants a second chance when it sees something that shouldn't be there. The moment I blinked, everything else went quiet. The cricket song, the creak of RV steps, the distant road sounds, gone. The hum was the only thing left, and it pressed around me like a held breath. For a second I thought the power in the campsite had cut, but the amber lights of other rigs twinkled on and off in the distance like fat insects. This silence was selective. It was close enough that I heard it. If I'm honest, I still don't know how to call it a sound. It wasn't a voice, but it had cadence. A short, soft staccato noise, like a mouth trying to shape syllables and giving up. For a sliver of a second, the figure tilted its head the way an animal does when it's trying to localize a sound. I took a slow step back, heart kicking inside my chest like a trapped thing. When I moved, it flinched, not like a human startled, but like something calibrating how much distance I posed as a threat. It flinched, and a shiver went down its length. That motion looked wrong, like something made of rubber briefly tensing. I froze. I considered yelling for Rachel. I thought about my phone, then reached for it. No bars. The screen lit, then the words, "No service," dispersed across the top like a final judgment. It was the same deadness I'd come to dread, cellular ghost town silence that made you feel cut away from the rest of the world. We stood there for several seconds that lengthened into minutes. The thing didn't lurch toward me. It didn't even take a step. It only watched, and the watching felt like being inspected under a microscope. I remember thinking of the kids asleep in the trailer and wanting to be somewhere else entirely, wanting the obvious, the human explanation. The quiet made the thought of running seem both urgent and monstrously stupid. If it could make all sounds stop, what would running do? Then it moved. Not toward me, but across the edge of the trees in a kind of staggering quick-slide motion. Imagine the figure folding like a marionette whose strings were being jerked. It made a small sound that wasn't a growl or a shout. It was a high, tight noise, like rubber drawn across glass. It turned, and before I could understand the shape of its retreat, it shot sideways into the darkness between trunks and vanished. No rustle, no breaking of branches. The woods took it in like it had always belonged there. What came next is the part I still stumble over when I try to put it into words. Time unstitched itself. One moment I was standing, cigarette in hand, feeling the after-image of that flinch, and the next it was dawn. Not hours exactly. My watch had skipped. Its hands flashed twice, and then it read a time that didn't reconcile with how I felt. My memory had a hole about the span between the figure's disappearance and the first grey wash of morning. I know this because when I woke Rachel, she asked where I'd gone, and I couldn't answer properly. I sat down at the picnic table and tried to count back. Maybe 10, maybe 30 minutes, maybe more, and it all collapsed into a single blank space, like text erased from a page. When the kids came out rubbing their eyes, the only thing I could tell them with any confidence was that I'd been out for a minute and wanted a soda. I remember staring at the horizon where the night had been and thinking that my mind was assembling a story around the absence, filling it with ordinary explanations. Late-night prank, dream interrupted, misremembered waking. But when I checked the ground where the figure had been, where I'd last seen it standing at the fringe of the pines, there were no footprints, not human prints, not animal scuffs. Just the layer of pine needles and the faint depressions of a normal campground. If something the size of that silhouette moved through there, it left nothing anyone could show me. We didn't call the police. There was no one to call, no evidence beyond a raw and nervous feeling, and I didn't want to become, in Rachel's words later, that couple. We pretended to be fine and packed up that morning, with the careful ritual of people deciding not to acknowledge a ghost in the room. I told a version of the story over a weak coffee while the kids chased each other with sleeping bags, but it came out small and embarrassed. She gave me a look that was half concern, half critique, and told me to stop smoking late at night. It was far easier for her to think I'd invented the episode out of a mix of stress and nicotine cravings than to admit there was a real hole in reality out there. For months I kept it private. Not because I was ashamed, though there was some of that, but because the hole in my memory made me feel like a damaged witness. People ask for details. How long exactly did it stand there? How close? What did it smell like? My answers were tentative. I found the thing that unseats credibility when the storymaker can't remember the middle. "I don't know" became my most honest phrase, and honesty is antiviral on social media. So I told it to very few friends, and to them in a clipped, deflective way. Some nights after that I would wake and think I heard the same low thrum beneath the house, a pressure like someone had set a tuning fork under the world. I would put my hand over Rachel's shoulder and watch her breathe, while I wondered if the sound had traveled miles between me and those other nights. The house with the doors yanked open, the lake with the light plays, and found me again. The same pattern was threading itself through, the same sensory bookmarks, a humming sound that wasn't quite a sound, movement that didn't obey the rules of bodies, the sudden nulling of ordinary things like phone service or ambient life, and the physical after-effects that leave no print and no neat explanation. The sunrise that followed the RV night had its own close call. While I stood looking at the sky, trying to make sense of the blank I felt in my memory, a raw, rushing noise swept overhead. It was the sort of sound that makes you stop breathing, the whoosh of something large and fast passing close, like a plane gone wrong. It moved from one side of the horizon to the other in a single breathless sweep, and then it was gone. When I looked up, there was nothing but thinning clouds and the early light. The kids laughed, chasing a drone one of the neighbors had brought, and the moment seemed to fold back into ordinary life. but the whoosh left on my skin a sense that whatever had been out there was not constrained to ground level, that whatever moved through that clearing of trees could, with a single motion, sever the sky. After that experience, I kept the story closer to me than anything else. I didn't file reports, I didn't take dramatic photos, I didn't publish a blog post. Some things are too intimate for strangers' commentary. But I began to notice something strange. In the years after those 3 nights, every time I read someone else's isolated account, people online talking about a hum, describing orbs over water, saying their doors blew open, my body remembered the texture of the events before my mind did. I would feel it in my jaw or the hollow of my throat, as if the memory was a small, stubborn animal hiding in my body, answering to cues from other people's stories. I wrestled with the urge to tidy the pattern into an explanation. I tried the usual mental chores: cross-reference, query, research, military exercises, atmospheric anomalies, hoaxes, misperception. Any framework that made sense was welcome. None fit neatly. The places these things happened had in common not only isolation, but a loss of ordinary certainties. Phones that stopped, doors that slammed open with no footsteps, animals that suddenly refused to participate in the world they had known. Those sensory details are the scaffolding that made the events feel real to me. They were not grand proof of anything beyond being shared, odd facts that resisted easy narrative. People who hear these stories tend to divide themselves into camps. There are the immediate believers who will thread the accounts into a larger theory and add them to a narrative that makes cosmic sense. There are the immediate doubters who will laugh or propose an explanation that feels neat and protective, like a blanket over a child. And then there are those like me who were once unshakable in skepticism and now find themselves unmoored. The change is subtle. The world doesn't flip to a new belief system, but there is a small, persistent looseness where certainty used to sit. I no longer dismiss every weird report with a neat, assumed cause. I hold the phenomena at arm's length and admit I don't know. That honesty is uncomfortable but necessary. What I will tell you with conviction is this: I witnessed things I could not explain. I felt my house shudder as if someone had punched the earth itself. I watched shapes move at the border of floodlight and night, and heard a sound that lived in my teeth. I watched spheres of light behave like living things over a black lake while my dog refused to step outside. I stood on a ledge at night, saw a tall, wrong silhouette watching me, and then found chunks of time erased like an unrecorded segment of a film. Each episode carried the same DNA, strange sensory markers, odd animal behavior, the nulling of communications, the lack of physical evidence where there should have been some. None of it proves anything beyond being genuine, unsettling experiences. I also want to be very clear about how I use the word UFO. I call these UFO encounters in the title because it's the broadest label that fits. Unidentified flying object, or, more loosely, unidentified phenomenon. That does not mean I'm saying they were extraterrestrial or interdimensional or secrets from a government program. It means that what I and others have seen cannot be satisfactorily explained by normal, everyday categories we use. They are unidentified. They are real to the people who witness them, and they leave traces in our nerves, whether they leave footprints on the ground or not. Living with that kind of not knowing changes you. It introduces a steady, low-grade tension to the way you interpret the world. You catch yourself listening for hums, checking the sky when light skitters oddly, watching dogs for signs you once dismissed as superstition. You also learn the social cost of talking about these things. Friends will try to make you feel safer by giving you answers, even if those answers are guesses. Strangers will tear the story apart for likes. The easiest path is silence, but silence keeps the experience private and isolates you. So what do I do with these memories now? I tell them. I tell them because they belong to me, and because part of my responsibility to a strange life is to offer what I know without forcing a conclusion. I tell them because it helps to place them in the broader mesh of other people's accounts. When stories stack, when someone in one town describes lights that behave like animals over water, and someone else in another state describes doors yanking open, and a third person mentions a tall silhouette in a stand of pines, patterns emerge that feel less random. Patterns are not proof, but they are data, and data is something we can use to keep asking honest questions. To anyone watching who has a story of their own, I know how fraught it is to press that memory into a sentence and put it where others will read it. I know how it feels to have your experience papered over by neat explanations or laughed out of a room. If you've experienced something like what I'm describing, an unexplained flash of light, a hum that makes the world go quiet, a silhouette that doesn't behave like any human, say so. Keep the sensory anchors. Report the hum, the loss of service, the animal reactions, the lack of footprints. Those are the pieces that make a story more than a rumor. I still don't know what to believe. I have been a skeptic and I have been unsettled. I have been in the kitchen while doors slammed and walked the dock while lights rehearsed movements that made my neck ache. The correct posture, as far as I can tell, is to hold both things at once, the desire to find an explanation and the humility to say honestly when one doesn't fit. There is bravery in admitting uncertainty in a world that prizes answers. There's also a kind of comfort in community, knowing other people have come awake in the night to something impossible and then gone about their days carrying that secret like a warm stone. If you have your own encounter, leave it in the comments below. I read everything I can, and I believe you more than the first laugh you might receive at a dinner table. If you want more first-hand UFO encounters and accounts like these, check the playlist that goes deeper into other witnesses' experiences. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what people have carried through the dark. I was a skeptic once. I still ask for proof, but I have learned to live with a quieter lesson. Some nights will rearrange what you thought was solid. The world is bigger and stranger at its edges than I had given it credit for, and sometimes the only honest thing we can do is tell the story and listen to the echoes.